I'd like to welcome you all here this morning, and a special welcome to our colleagues from South Ayrshire, Councillor Brian McGinley, Chair of the Scrutiny and Governance Management Panel, and Eileen Riley, got that right, Committee Services Officer and the Resources Governance and Organisation Directorate. South Ayrshire Council is undertaking a review of its scrutiny arrangements, and this visit is a follow-up to an officer meeting which took place earlier this month with our Assistant Chief Executive and Senior Manager, Planning and Performance, where our scrutiny handbook and approach to identifying and undertaking scrutiny reviews was discussed in some detail. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind members that this meeting is being recorded and will be subsequently available for public listening. On the subject of recording, I would ask you to ensure that you use your microphones at all times when speaking and that you speak clearly into the microphone. I'll better remember not to mumble. Ask the clerk, do we have any apologies?
Good morning. We have apologies from Councillor Karen Crothers. 8 members are present. Councillor Wall may be along in a moment.
Move on to item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Thank you for that. We'll now move on to item 3, which is scrutiny review, procurement and commissioning, presentation and evidence session with Unison, report by Assistant Chief Executive. I'm just wondering if Mr. Watson has arrived, because we were still waiting.
Yes,
he's here. All right.
Yes, he's outside.
So do you want me to welcome him when he's not here?
I'll wait to welcome him.
We're receiving the presentation from Mr. Watson, and at the end of it there will be the presentation. Members are invited to ask questions of the Unison representatives as highlighted in paragraph 3.4. So, well, good morning, gentlemen, and welcome. It's nice to welcome two Davids from Unison to our meeting this morning. We have Dave Watson, Scottish Organiser, Bargaining and Campaigns, and David Stainthorpe, Branch Secretary for Dumfries and Galloway. David, would you like to make your presentation to us? Copies of the presentation will be available at the end, or are being circulated now, is it?
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, colleagues. All the public services, some monolith of in-house delivery, and actually that isn't the case. As you can see, some £10 billion of procurement, that's almost a third of the Scottish Government's budget, goes externally from in-house provision. So it's big business. And the traditional approach to dealing with procurement has been to focus on best value and efficiency, and more recently looking at ways of streamlining the process using e-procurement and making it easier, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. And that's important and is also the focus of the current procurement bill. There's also been development of new structures in relation to the delivery of services, a growth of arm's length organisations, of trusts and other formats which don't have the direct control of the council, and an increasing use of the voluntary sector, particularly in the care field. Also remind you that the Christie Commission on the future delivery of public services in Scotland spent quite a lot of time looking at procurement and the way we organise and structure matters, talking about bottom-up delivery of services, and introducing the concepts of co-production and asset-based approaches, which are trying to be introduced in procurement, though it's obviously difficult to do. But the big idea, of course, in the Christie Commission was about better integration of the delivery of public services. Finally, of course, we've got the Procurement Reform Bill, which is going through Parliament at present. We're heading towards the stage 3, the final stage of that bill. And linked with that very closely is the new EU procurement directive that has been passed by Parliament, so it won't get cut off by the European elections, and that will result in further changes to the procurement regulations, which drive a lot of procurement practice in the UK, in fact in everywhere in Europe, because a lot of the rules are set down by Europe themselves. Just a few words about what I would call the contract culture, if you like, some cautionary principles. Clearly, we believe strongly as a trade union in the public service principles and values, and that was, if you like, core to the Christie Commission's recommendations as well. We caution against the fragmentation of service delivery in Scotland. Some of you, well, no one here, including me, will remember, but in the century before last, local government was very fragmented. In fact, local government was invented to bring together public services, and we would caution against too much fragmentation in the delivery of service for that reason. Another reason, as Christie identified, and of course because of the loss of democratic accountability. We'd also warn against the inefficiency of the traditional client-contractor split. There are very heavy transaction costs, essentially employing two people to do the same job. The use of consultants and advisors has grown to many millions of pounds in Scotland in recent years. I noticed in your report you flagged up the issue of the two-tier workforce. Actually, the two-tier workforce ought not to be a problem anymore. There are regulations laid down under Section 52 of the Local Government Scotland Act, which actually debars the two-tier workforce. What actually says is all your procurement should specify that there won't be a two-tier workforce on that basis. Now, I'm bound to say, I haven't checked your particular contracts, but it's not always properly applied in Scotland, as it should be. This is not through any malicious nature, it's just that it's not a well understood or well used piece of legislation. Finally, probably talk about outsourcing. It's sometimes claimed that outsourcing is somehow efficient. A big study was done by that for the UK government, where there was a claim under the old contracting culture that there were savings could be as high as 25%. When they actually did the numbers after the process, the actual savings ranged from a loss of 16% to savings of 8%. And as the International Monetary Fund, not exactly a bastion of left-wing thinking, they said it was the theory is ambiguous and the empirical evidence is mixed. So that's a bit of background. What I want to focus on is really around some of the broader policy goals which we think that councils and other public bodies should be adopting in relation to procurement. In other words, just buying things is fine, but actually it's a lot of money and you can get a lot more value out of procurement. And we encapsulate that, and in your handouts today, what are called the 10 asks. The 10 asks were drafted by myself and a number of other civil society organisations, including the STUC, the Scottish voluntary sector organisations, and a number of the development charities. And we pulled together a range of asks which we think the public bodies can use procurement to achieve. I'll leave the first three because I'm going to come back to them, but others include issues like blacklisting, which there's now new Scottish Government guidance to ensure that that's outlawed in procurement. A focus on sustainable procurement and cutting emissions, carbon emissions. That's already a duty on councils like yours in relation to your public sector duty under the Climate Change Act. So it's about using procurement to ensure you deliver on those goals. And of course, the importance of fair trade. And I know in this area you've done quite a lot on that already. Perhaps I could focus on the three. Obviously, for us, the most important is the living wage. Now at £7.65 per hour, not exactly a king's ransom, but nonetheless a very important benefit for those who get it. And we've made great progress in Scotland. Almost all in public sector now pays a living wage. We have a new accreditation scheme to encourage private sector employers, and the gap, if you like, is in procurement. The advantage of living wage, I think, are probably well understood. Workers get higher wages, improves health and job motivation. That's pretty obvious. For employers, however, the living wage is good news as well. It reduces turnover, improves productivity, and attracts better staff. All of these have been evaluated in a range of studies done across the UK. And of course, the benefits to the community, because sub-living wage employers actually cost us, the taxpayer, about £6 billion a year. That's because 1 in 5 workers in Scotland are still paid below the living wage. And there's an indirect cost to us all in poverty of about £25 billion a year. I probably don't put Conservative politicians in my slides very often, but Boris Johnson, I think, is a good example of a politician who's done some very good stuff in that area. The Greater London Council is a leading light in living wage and the way they promoted it through, and the reason they do it, and it demonstrates, if you like, the cross-party approach to the living wage, is because it has those benefits that he identifies there. The Scottish Living Wage in procurement terms essentially spreads the benefit of the Scottish Living Wage, the public spending in the private sector. It also, and I think it's important, we would make the economic case for an increase in real wages. In other words, the benefit it drives to local economies in particular. Lower paid workers spend more of their money locally, and therefore increasing wages actually benefits a range of businesses in the community. The way you do that, I'm happy to, it's much more complicated, I won't do it in my presentation, but the way of doing that legally is through what we call contract performance clauses. The current guidance from the Scottish Government says there are some EU legal difficulties. You might have seen in this morning's Scotsman that the First Minister was somewhat taken to task on this point by the EU themselves in relation to this point, and actually made the point that we've been making in our own legal advice to government. But I'm pleased to say that to a large extent, these matters are like to be resolved in that the Scottish Government is now bringing forward an amendment to Stage 3 of the Procurement Bill to put the living wage in the face of the legislation. Another way that the living wage ought to be feeding through procurement is through Section 52 of the Local Government Act, because that actually requires councils to ensure there isn't a two-tier workforce, and given that council workforces generally are paid on the living wage, that when services are outsourced, or even where there's a change of service provider for an already outsourced contract, then there should not be a two-tier workforce between the council staff and those in the voluntary or the private sector. The other point I want to flag up, and this tied very closely to this, is really about person-centred procurement. It's one of the 10 asks that we and the voluntary sector in particular, and we're the largest trade union also in the voluntary sector in Scotland, put forward. And we produced a report recently called It's Time to Care. And we did that because I did a range of focus groups with home care staff, and frankly was pretty horrified by the sort of messages that the staff who are delivering care, particularly for elderly people, were giving us back about the standard of care, the things that they were having to do to meet the requirements, particularly of contracts. And I put that quote in there, but if you read that report, you will see there are dozens and dozens of similar quotes from frontline staff. And so what we essentially ask councils to do is to consider what we call our ethical care charter. Again, there's a link in the materials I've given you to that. And that includes the living wage, but includes also the use of zero-hour contracts, something that's been heavily criticised, particularly by the Scottish Affairs Committee recently. But also it's about providing time. One of the key things that home care workers told us was that they simply did not have the time to care. They were rushing in, rushing out, particularly not being given travel time, an issue in rural areas in particular, where staff were saying they simply didn't know. They were having to cut short a visit to make sure they could get to their next visit. Again, some good news through the procurement bill and the EU directive. There are now going to be new thresholds, quite high thresholds, around £730,000, below which, in fact, health and care procurement can be exempted from the tighter rules in the EU area. So there's an opportunity there, and that again has been fed into the bill and the subsequent guidance that will be heading in your direction. Finally, of the three, it's about, I'd ask you to look at tax justice as an issue in relation to procurement. We have probably the biggest ever tax gap in UK history. About £120 billion of tax is not collected either by evasion or avoidance. Quoting another coalition minister, something I don't often do, but this is Danny Alexander, not Douglas. Taxpayers' money should not be funding tax dodgers, and that seems to be a pretty obvious arrangement. And your voters feel the same way about that. 86% in the recent opinion poll said it was important that to reduce tax avoidance by companies. So what we're really talking about here is councils across Europe, including the UK, are starting to use procurement to exclude contractors who use, the phrase is usually artificial tax avoidance arrangements. So this is not It's maybe legal ones, but they're still artificial. And obviously, I put the obvious one of Starbucks and Costa comparison in that slide, but Amazon and others are well-known examples of companies that use a variety of mechanisms to avoid paying tax on income which is earned in this country. So in conclusion, what we'd say about procurement is that it's an important part of the work of any council. It should be used when it's appropriate to do so, because you want to avoid the risks of the contract culture, which isn't terribly efficient. But when you do use procurement, we'd ask you to use it not just to do the basic techie bits, which are traditionally done by procurement staff, but to think about some of the wider policy goals, about living wage, about employment standards, getting ethical care procurement right, thinking about tax justice and sustainability and fair trade. Essentially, it's about getting more out of the public spend. And I've left you a few resources, a few links as well, convened on that basis.
That was a lot of information there to take in, and I'm sure there'll be good few questions on various items. I suppose the living wage has been one that we've had sort of raised with us in the past, where it's how can we look to implement that in our contract procurement. And I think it's down to the fact that you've got this two-tier you're talking about, whereby section 52, I think it was you mentioned. What happens when we procure public sector jobs to a private company which uses the living wage, compared to a private sector company who stays in the private sector and the workers are left behind because they're working on the living wage? How do we make sure that everybody benefits out of this, not just certain individuals who get onto the council list?
Sorry. Yes, that's the purpose of Section 52, because that's exactly what was happening prior to that provision coming into force. What happened was that staff were outsourced from local authority into a contractor, and they ended up working side by side with people who were not being paid on that basis. Section 52 was supposed to end that, and essentially the contract that you specify to a contractor reminds them that Section 52 is there, and they are required to ensure that there is not a two-tier workforce, so that the existing workforce must be paid on the same terms and conditions and wages, including living wage, that those transfer on that basis. So that when you outsource a new contract, or even if you change a service provider, so let's say you've got a contract out at the moment, and it comes up for renewal, and you then come to retender that contract, again, you write into the specification that Section 52 applies, and we don't expect to see a two-tier workforce. That becomes part of the contract, which you can then do it. In terms of the living wage, what essentially, obviously, there'll be new guidance being issued as a result of the procurement bill, but essentially if you look at the current government amendments, they accept our argument that what you do is you set out in your procurement strategy that you are a living wage employer and you expect your contractors to be living wage employers as well. Therefore, you get contractors will bid on that basis. You will evaluate those contracts, you will appoint those contractors because they meet your strategy, and you will then write that into the contract. And if they don't pay the living wage, that's a breach of contract. It's what we call a contract performance clause. So that's the legal way that you get around it. What you can't do, and this is where the legal difficulty comes in, is you cannot make it a requirement on that company to have a living wage right across all its operations. So that's why you can't make it a pre-qualification clause. And the reason for that is that you might have a big company that has contracts out with the council, which have nothing to do with the council, nothing to do with public procurement, and therefore would be unlawful to essentially, desirable but unlawful, sadly, to spread the living wage in that way.
Just as the main contractor, do the same rules apply to subcontractors? Can you say, well, if you employ a subcontractor, you have to implement living wage for them?
Yes, indeed. Every good contract ought to have what we call a subcontractor clause, essentially giving you as the the client control over that. It sometimes gets missed in procurement practice, but it's something that shouldn't get missed, and a good subcontract clause is standard irrespective of living wage, to be honest. There's a whole range of other reasons why you would want to have control over use of subcontracting, local employment, some of your disability work, a whole range of reasons why you would not want to see those drifting away.
Councillor Gilroy.
Thank you. I'm just looking at your conclusions, Mr. Watson, and it's the last slide, I think, and I'm wondering, what do you mean by fair trade? Fair trade. Fair trade.
Sorry, I'm used to Parliament where it comes from. In terms of the 10 asks, the fair trade, there is a charter and a set of provisions set down by the fair trade organisations in Scotland, and they have a set of rules and accreditation mechanisms in terms of fair trade. I appreciate that some of those there are differences of opinions over some of those, but those are the rules that are laid down. So if you qualify for a fair trade, either a particular good or sometimes as a fair trade area, etc. There are rules that are laid down by the Fair Trade Organisation in Scotland, and in their website and their charter they lay down what those are. So essentially it's an accreditation criteria in the same way as there is the living wage and others.
So that's different from fairly trading then?
Absolutely, yeah. Fair trade has a particular meaning here. It's whether it's fair, obviously they would say it is fair trading, but it's not in the loose sense of the word. It's about a very specific accreditation criteria.
Councillor Brodie and then Councillor Dykes.
Thanks, Chair. You were talking about the internal market and the client and contractor sort of split within the organisation and being inefficient. We've got a commissioning and delivery model. I don't know whether our local Unison like to say, well, he sees efficiencies or inefficiencies in that system. What's the sort of Unison view on that, and perhaps the national one as well?
I think the fair answer to that would be there's probably both. From our point of view as a group that wants to promote good labour relations with employers, though what we do find is that a lot of the services that or the employers who provide services that are commissioned by the council aren't actually particularly good employers when it comes to staff relationships. We're seeing a number of cases where there's discrimination over race, age, etc. A number of cases where there are equality issues as well. And I don't think I've come across any cases, any places so far where the Section 52 standardisation of pay rates is actually put in place.
I mean, I think that's a fairly common experience, and it's something which a lot of councils are now currently addressing, particularly have to say in the care sector. I think your question might have also focused around the structure of how we do that. I think, I mean, clearly, if you are commissioning, you have to have a structure to do that with a client-contractor arrangement, and therefore that's fairly standard. And that ought to provide the expertise, essentially, to ensure things like Section 52, subcontract clauses, and all these other technical areas are properly addressed. So I don't have any problem with the structure of doing that. I think all you need to remember with all procurement is that it's an expensive thing to do, and what we've seen is a whole range of additional, what are sometimes called transaction costs being added to procurement, not always obvious, particularly internal staff time is not always obvious that it's spent in an awful lot of these procurement areas. Yeah, I've been involved in drafting government procurement guidance, and I know the amount of work that goes into that side of things. So there are huge costs there, not all of which are obvious to councils and other public bodies.
Councillor Dykes.
Thank you. You mentioned the EU Procurement Directive and changes to the legislation. My understanding is that although that's coming through, there's a time scale of when those should be implemented, and that the Scottish Government as yet have not set the deadline for the changes to come into play. I think the Westminster Government have determined that they'll be in before the end of the year, but currently in the Scottish Government side of things, they're still waiting for a deadline date for that.
Yeah, I think there's two things we probably need to separate here. One is the procurement bill changes, which are currently going through Parliament. That can be implemented, frankly, as soon as the Scottish Government's ready to do so. What you'll find, I suspect, there is that that is being primary legislation, is pretty broad brush. It sets out the big picture. The detail that your officers need to see in terms of applying it to individual contracts comes in guidance and secondary legislation. So there'll be a timescale to do that. That should be fairly quick. The second part, which you rightly focused on, is the EU directive, the new one. That will have to be implemented in Scotland, what's called the contracting regulations, public contracts regulations. And the UK government for England and Wales has indicated it wants to move fairly quickly. By law, you have to implement these within 2 years. However, the UK government, because there are bits of it really likes, which is not usual with EU rules, but on this occasion there are bits that they like. So they've said, actually, we're going to get a move on with this. My experience of helping with the drafting of these types of regulations and guidance in Scotland is that the civil servants of Scotland like to see what they're doing in England. There's not saying they cut and paste, but in one or two occasions they've directly cut and pasted, in fact, in terms of the regulations. So there is a tendency to look at the English regulations and then adapt them for Scotland on that basis. So I would guess they'll want to see what's happening down south. But I don't think this is going to be a case where we're waiting the 2 years. I think this is one that will come along a bit quicker.
Sorry, I understand what you're saying, and I also understand that there was a draft came out from the EU which has had some quite a large change on what's actually been put forward now, and that will all have to be discussed, I presume, as we move forward.
Yes, it's the nature of the European elections that they focus attention on moving the European Union a tad quicker than they normally move. Normally these things go through many, many stages, and because they were very keen to get this in before the cut, because otherwise you've got to start right from scratch again. So they did that. There were some changes, but the reality is that most procurement professionals have been following this for the last 3 years. We know pretty much what's coming along and how it's going to apply in Scotland. So to an extent, quite a lot of work has already been done on this, and there's no reason why we couldn't implement it quite quickly.
Sorry, can I just come back? Because there was a large change, wasn't there, in the fact that in the draft that came out from Europe originally, they stipulated that if you had a bad performing company who carried out a contract for you at that point in time, then you had every right, if you could prove that they had not performed correctly throughout the contract, that you did not need to consider them when you were moving forward to replace the contract, or actually to go out and contract the same sort of service again. However, when the actual documentation has come out, there has been a massive move back from that stage by the European side of things, and actually it is not the case as such. The proving that a company has not carried out their duties correctly has taken a massive step back in my understanding.
I would agree it's not helpful in relation. It was one of those last-minute compromises to get it through. Obviously, the UK government was one of the outliers in terms of the best. However, on that particular point, I would say that actually the current UK and certainly the current Scottish regulations of the public contract regs already allow us to do most of that. The problem we often have, both here in Scotland and more broadly in the UK, is that frankly we're over-cautious about the way we apply the contract regulations. We read things into it and don't do things that frankly we should. Too often I've sat with very often councils and the government has a tendency to ask, and I'm not a procurement professional, I'm a lawyer, so I know exactly the sort of advice. Too often people say to lawyers, what's the legal position, when what you should say to us is, we want to do this, Dave, tell me how we can do it most safely in legal terms. And that's a different mindset, and frankly in procurement all too often I've sat down meeting after meeting where people said, oh well, we might get challenged on this. To where I said, well, you might, but the reality is that, show me where this likely challenge is going to happen, and and that's a very good example of that. The current regulations allow you to take into account the performance of past contracts, not just with you, but with other organisations. So, and that's frankly what we do. I mean, we train our local officials when they're doing the evaluation stage of contracts. We have very detailed guidance, which I do training on, and we actually provide information. We have databases. We actually very often say to council, did you know that this particular contractor failed in X council and Y? You might want to ask the questions of that council why it was, and you are allowed to take that into account. So I agree with you. The language of the amendment was unhelpful, but frankly, we can do most of this now. It's not a reason for delay.
Councillor Wiper.
Thank you, Chair. Morning. Couple of questions. One's based on fairness to people who are not in the public sector, who are paid the minimum wage. My proper job, I run a community project which we rely heavily on the voluntary sector, and a few full-time employees, some of which are paid the minimum wage. And I wonder how fair it is for their tax money being used to pay more than £1 an hour to people who are probably doing the same job with the same qualifications. And the other part of my question is, if you have blogs and company bidding for a contract for the council who pay minimum wage to their employees to make them competitive, they are then being forced to pay the living wage. If they then want to go up against another contractor for a job that is not council funded, they can't put their employees back down to minimum wage again, so that makes them less competitive in the private market. You follow me?
Obviously, you'll not be surprised I would turn your question round the other way in terms of fairness. Is it fair that we as taxpayers subsidise sub-living wage employers? Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what we're doing by many billions of pounds a year. And one of the purposes of living wage is to ensure that we get people above that level where we're paying benefits to. Remember, half the people in receipt of state benefits are in employment. So it's actually in-work poverty, which is one of the major problems we have in the UK. So as a matter of public policy for public bodies, as a matter of policy, which is why the Scottish Government and others have moved in this direction, is to promote the idea of the living wage so that we don't actually subsidise bad employers. So I would put it the other way around. It's not a case of being unfair. The unfairness is the minimum wage employees of these particular companies that ought to be paid at the living wage. The purpose of the two-tier workforce provisions is to minimise the risk of your last point about blogs and co and the impact on that basis. Clearly, in the contracting provisions, I said, as far as the council is concerned, you cannot enforce the contract into the wider area. If there's no public contract, you can't do that. So what a company chooses to do in terms of its wage strategy is the matter between that company and its employees in relation to work which has nothing to do with the council or the health board or any other public body in Scotland. They have that particular option. Obviously, the purpose of the living wage, and remember, the Scottish Government is now funding a range of accreditation strategies, so it's not just through procurement, it's actually encouraging the living wage as a voluntary act, as it were, and there are many companies which have signed up to doing that. Not just big companies, quite a lot of small companies have also done that, largely because they've been won over to, if you like, the Boris Johnson argument, which is that this is actually a good thing. Having a high turnover, labour force, people always underestimate the cost of paying below the living wage. They forget the turnover of staff, they forget the issue of motivation, they forget the issue of health. They don't tend to take those factors into account. And good companies have worked out actually living wage makes good business sense as well, which is why it has this support from a lot of very big companies, private companies who have no public contracts at all.
Yeah, I fully understand, and I agree with your point on the living wage and its implications against, what do you call it, tax credits, etc., for people who are on low wages. But there's simply an awful lot of companies out there that probably can't afford to pay the living wage on the income that they're getting from whatever source their income comes from. But my second point was really, if Bloggs and Company do win that contract for the council at $7.65 an hour paying their employees, but that contract is then done, they get paid, etc. They then want to try and bid for a contract that council has nothing to do with, a private contract. They are then paying their workforce, the possibility of paying their workforce £1 an hour more than a company they're going up against. And there will be other companies who are paying minimum wage. So it makes them less competitive in the private market if they're being dictated to by the council to what they have to pay their staff.
Well, in the strict sense, they're not being dictated to. My point is you can't dictate to those companies what they pay in relation to contracts out with the council. So it is a matter between that company and their employees on that basis. All I'd say is that you don't. One of the problems we have in the UK is this idea that the way to go forward in terms of winning contracts and delivery is solely on a race to the bottom on pay and conditions. There are other ways of winning contracts. There are other ways to win them on quality. There are other ways of actually delivering on the service specification. It's part of the issue about contract quality and monitoring on that basis. But you don't just win on price. I can point you to a whole range of private companies who have signed up to the living wage, never see a penny of public money. Big companies signed up to it because they see the benefits of doing so. And I'm not just talking about the blue chips, if you like, the Scottish and Southerns, the Avivas, the KPMGs, who were the original drivers with the trade unions around the Living Wage Foundation. But lots of quite small companies have come on board and done the same. And they argue that they can win contracts. They argue they can produce a better quality product because they've got a workforce which is motivated, it's stable, it provides the continuity of care. I accept it. It will vary from industry to industry. It's easier in some industries than others. Some industries, like care, for example, continuity of care is very, very, very important. It's a high factor to it. In others, some of the hospitality areas, etc., there are fewer living wage companies because they rely on a more flexible, a more here today, gone tomorrow type of workforce. So I think your point has value in some industries, but generally speaking, I would argue that living wage has been a success in those areas where continuity of care in particular is an important factor for the company and for their staff.
Councillor Maitland.
I would think there might be an issue of rurality as well, Chairman. I would suspect strongly that it might be the case that we actually here have very considerably less turnover, much more stable number of people who stay in jobs because we are a very settled society. I'm curious. I mean, I understand where you're coming from as far as the union is concerned, but I'm interested as to the sort of main driver, because inevitably at the margin there must be a pressure on the numbers of jobs. So I mean, it's a question of whether you're interested more in pay and conditions or whether you're more interested in the actual number of jobs. I'd be quite interested to have your thoughts on that in the light of this area where we do not have the sort of pressures that are in London. People come and go and come and go and come and go. And frankly, actually, the levels of pay in London, what Boris Johnson was talking about, I mean, frankly, it's irrelevant to us here because we are a much, much lower paid area, as you know, I'm sure.
Yes, I tend to put Boris up simply to demonstrate the cross-party support for the line. But let's be clear that it's not all. Right across Scotland we have a living wage. In fact, there's more living wage as a proportion in Scotland than there is elsewhere in the UK. And Scotland's about mid-league table at the moment in terms of wages across the UK on that basis. So I think there is a broad support for it. It's on that basis. Yes, of course, there is a cost doing that. In terms of jobs, there have been some very detailed studies being done, and I would remind you that before the minimum wage came in, the CBI and others told us there was going to be massive job losses as a result of the increase of the introduction of the minimum wage. None of that happened at all. There was absolutely no evidence, and the studies done right across the UK, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation did one, including Scotland and the rest of the UK quite recently, and they looked at the issue of jobs, etc. And again, there was no evidence that the introducing the living wage had resulted in jobs. So we don't see it as an either-or. It's not a trade-off in terms of fewer jobs but better pay. But certainly there is and it's also there is a moral issue, obviously, about subsidising sub-living wage employers from the taxpayer. But I do emphasise, and I talk to a lot of businesses as part of. I'm a member of the Living Wage Committee in Scotland, and Scotland have been Scotland's representative on the foundation. We talk to a lot of businesses, and the new accreditation schemes will be full-time staff going around talking to businesses. The Scottish Government has provided some funding to help do that. I think there's a very receptive view from businesses, but there are variations, and I'd accept that. And I think your other colleague's question was valid, and my answer to that one is I think we haven't made as much progress in some industries as we have in others. So I think there are variations on that basis, and part of that is about, if I tend to emphasise the business case rather than the moral case, I do that deliberately because we have to spend a lot of time persuading businesses this is a good thing to do. And we have done. There are thousands now of firms that pay that. Some are accredited, some are not. And they have bought into that. But there is a difference in industries, and if we haven't cracked it anywhere, we haven't cracked it probably in the traditional high turnover areas like hospitality and catering. Those are the sort of areas where we've been less successful than other areas in doing that, and that's about the business model. I will have a debate with those businesses about their business model, but nonetheless, that business model exists, and it's about changing that. It's difficult for one company to change that because you've got to get a block of companies to change the business culture away from that short-termism that tends to apply, sadly, too often in British business.
Might I come back? Just a couple of things. Yes, what you've got to do is persuade the punter, and particularly in something like the hospitality industry, that it is worth paying that level of money. And most of us actually go out and are outraged when we're asked to pay, a tenner a burger, or we'd be appalled if we had to do that. But that's the problem. That's what it comes down to. Sorry, I cannot let you go. The minimum wage, while I acknowledge, has not had the problems that were put towards it, but it did actually coincide with a major period of growth. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I accept that, but equally I'd say studies have been done since, and certainly since the crash with the living wage, which still show the same, and there's been no impact on that basis. I'd also say that even the companies that say to me, Dave, look, it's very difficult, and the price marginal difference for paying the living wage is not that great in many of those areas. Other companies say, actually, we can compete in other areas to balance that up. But you're right, to an extent that we, as consumers and as taxpayers, need to understand the arguments. Why should we subsidise? In fact, why should I subsidise your burger? Because my tax money is going to pay for subsidising that employer to pay lower wages. So I think if people start to understand that, and I think also start to understand the impact of low wages on our economy, particularly in low-wage economies and the effect that has, and rural areas in particular, then we start to get a different dialogue going. But I accept this is not something you can click your fingers and get there tomorrow. It's a gradual change in terms of the way we make that policy change.
One of the things you brought up, which sort of made my ears flap a wee bit, you said there's an inbuilt culture, I think it was, that you said about the fact that how do we avoid risk rather than how do we get round the problem. Are there any examples of good teams in councils in Scotland, because we're looking at this just now, where they have the right mix and culture of actually, that's what we want to do, this is how we get round it. Legally, better add that part.
Well, this is where it gets difficult, because obviously some of these things, the advice you give, you wouldn't want published for obvious reasons. If I give you an example of around the living wage is a very good example at the moment. I was with a council the other day, and the council's solicitor said to me, "Oh well, Dave, we'd love to do the living wage, but we might get challenged legally on that basis." And I said, okay, let's do the risk analysis here. Who's going to challenge you? And they're saying, oh, well, we could be, so on what basis? And the only outstanding legal issue in Europe is the Posted Workers Directive. Everyone accepts that's the only legal risk that you could get challenged under the Posted Workers Directive. Now, though you're not familiar with the Posted Work Directive, it was dreamt up by Europe, so a situation where you could have, let's say, a cleaning firm in Poland could bring their workforce to Dumfries to do a cleaning contract in Dumfries. Now, the Posted Workers Directive, you can work out for yourself, the chances of being challenged by a Polish cleaning company in that way is pretty remote. If you were offering a high-value contract, like the challenge has been the North Sea, off the English coast, the Total dispute you might remember a few years ago, these are very high-paid jobs where it's worth the while of these companies to bring their workforce over. Can you really imagine the Polish cleaning company bringing, will it be predominantly a female workforce, 100 cleaners, say, from Poland, fly them into Dumfries, put them up in Dumfries to run a particular contract, all for £1 an hour saving, because they still have to pay the minimum wage, so you save £1 an hour on that basis. The economics of this do not add up, and this is why there's not been any legal challenge. Why? Boris Johnson's a good example of that. This came up, an insurance company raised this at the last meeting of the Living Wage Foundation in London, and they said, we hear there's this risk of a legal challenge. Boris Johnson's staff said at that meeting, they said, and he said this publicly to his committee, so I'm not breaking any confidences. He said, they said, but the chance of challenge is so remote that if we took that view, we'd never do anything. And that's really my answer to in that case, I won't name the council, but the council solicitor, I said, in your risk analysis, show me where this bit's going to happen. It's just a myth. It's not going to happen in this particular area. Yes, if you've got a high-value engineering contract, there might be an issue, but the living wage isn't going to apply there because no one's going to be paid anywhere like that wage. They're all going to be way above that wage. So I think there is a culture, inevitably, of being risk-averse in the public sector for very good reason. I dealt with, for example, the BCCI collapse in the Western Isles and had to go and help the council in those circumstances. And I understand. The phrase often goes, no one ever sacked your director of finance for underspending, but they often sacked the director of finance for overspending. And the same applies to legal advice. So people are cautious, and rightly so in the public sector. We shouldn't be taking great risks, but these are not great risks. We still have to have a sensible risk analysis, and obscure legal challenge, or the risk of obscure legal challenge, is frankly no way to run any business, including a council.
So if you're putting together a team for procurement, if you were doing it, who should be the person or the people in there? Should it be weighted in favour of legal advice or in procurement advice, or should it be people who are less risk averse, who think, well, this is what we could do?
You obviously have to build an effective team, and that needs all the skills. So, I'm not saying you weight your teams. Clearly, in procurement, you need the procurement professionals. It is a challenge in Scotland, as the McClellan report highlighted. There is a shortage of procurement professionals, particularly in the public sector. Wages have not been as high as they have in the private sector, so we haven't always been able to even recruit to posts, let alone obviously attract the very best people. So there is a a problem there, but obviously you need those because they have the technical skills, they understand the regulations. I would also, however, obviously you need legal advice because the legal issues will come up. What I would suggest is, and obviously you have the benefit of being a reasonable sized council, that do ensure that your legal teams have got people who do have experience and knowledge, or at least develop that in the procurement area. I have been smaller councils where I've sat down and, in fairness to the solicitor in front of me, they've never really dealt with procurement. They've dealt with a range of other things, and they are catching up. And the law's like anything else. It's become more specialist over the years, and you can't expect a generalist to be an expert on everything. But I'd also ensure that you've got what I would call procurement policy specialists. So it's not just and in many cases, their job is the ones to ask the difficult questions. I'm not a procurement specialist, but very often in these circumstances, I might be the policy expert who might pose those difficult questions and say, is that really a threat? Have we thought about that? Are we including that? And the key to good procurement, we have, you can download it off our website with very detailed advice that we train our local branches in, is the involvement of the people who are going to receive the service and the staff who are delivering the service. Very often with procurement exercises that have gone wrong, it's because the procurement team goes into a darkened room and produces a specification and all the stuff, and they don't have enough dialogue with the people who are delivering the service, the frontline staff, and the users of the service as well. So I think that's a vitally important part of the process. I think we're getting much better at that, about to say, in Scotland. I think a lot of councils are now doing a lot of very imaginative things about engaging with people. But procurement, for some reason, is but that's a legal issue. But it's not. You can go out and talk to people. At the end of the day, you are buying a service or buying things. Go and talk to the people who are receiving it.
Councillor Dykes.
Thank you. I was interested in your comments about risk analysis as well. However, I wanted to just quickly ask, you mentioned about outsourcing. And I agree with you. There are outsourcing can work, and sometimes people do get the wrong idea about outsourcing as well, and they do think that it's going to save huge amounts of money, and sometimes it's better to do it in-house. But in my opinion, they need to, if you are looking at outsourcing, for example, you should really be doing your risk analysis side of things, and you should determine whether or not whatever you're looking to outsource is critical to the business, or whether you could maybe use it as stationery and you call off. I have no issue with setting in motion a contract, for example, stationery, where the procurement team set up the contract and then individuals call off as per their budget allows. I have no issue with that. But on the critical side of things, for example, if you were looking at waste management, in my opinion, that would be high risk and high spend. So therefore, you should scrutinise that more and determine whether or not there is any possibility, because if it is of a critical risk to the council and a high spend, then these are the types of things that a procurement sector should be heavily involved in. You also mentioned about specifications. I mean, in my opinion, the specifications should be helped or should be drawn up by the end users as much as anything else, but not procured by them. I have a huge issue about end users determining what they want to procure without actually determining what the specification is. You need to know what it is you actually need to use, not that you want the highest spend, the best quality of whatever, because it might be that you just need to specify that I need a pipe and it needs to be able to do this job and it needs to be so many inches long and so many feet wide or whatever. But they just need to determine what it is they want to use. But the procurement team should be doing the purchasing, because in my opinion, not everybody can buy. It is a specialist role, and we should have a specialist procurement team with a director at the highest level, because until any organisation in the public sector accept that procurement is up there and can actually save not just money, it isn't just about financial savings, but it's about quality and about getting a win-win situation for the public sector as well as for the company that you're procuring from. And until we actually get that into our heads, at a strategic level, at the highest chief exec level, then you were never going to get anywhere.
I'd largely agree with that. I think there are very clear skills, and as I said, I think the Macmillan report's largely been forgotten, largely because he's done several since then. But actually, his report on procurement, I think, still is worth reading in many of those areas, and he emphasised the importance of the skills that are required to deliver in that area. I think we're not taking an ideological view and saying everything should be clearly, as I said, almost a third of Scottish Government funding currently goes outside. So because there is this myth that we have this monolith of public service provision in Scotland, which isn't actually true and never has been true on that basis. I think there are reasons, certainly in the purchasing of things, even in our most optimistic moment, we wouldn't argue for the council to set up its own stationery company, and nor would we would also say there are very specialist skills for one-off projects, which it wouldn't be a good idea necessarily for a particular council to buy in those particular skills as an in-house operation, because you wouldn't have enough of them, you wouldn't have the flexibility, and may not have the skills and knowledge in that special area. So they're all areas where you quite legitimately would want to do that. I think in terms of the risk, I'd largely agree with you. I think that there are things that you need to focus on. Two areas I think I'd focus on in addition to the ones you've indicated. One is think about flexibility. One of the problems about procuring outsourcing contracts, and obviously PPP and PFI were the worst examples of this, where people were signing up to 25, in some cases 60-year contracts. Now, you just don't have the flexibility in those areas. Now, we've learned a lot of lessons from that, sadly very expensive lessons for the taxpayer in Scotland, but nonetheless, there's a lot of money that's gone down the drain there, largely because we haven't got the flexibility. I don't think there's anyone in your education department who could tell you what a school was going to look like in 60 years' time. I expect they couldn't tell you it's going to look in 25 years' time. I spent a lot of time working in the health service. I couldn't have told you what a hospital would look like 10 or 15 years ahead, and yet we were signing off contracts for 25 years. Now, so think about flexibility. Is this a service that you're going to want to change? In which case, do not buy in to too longer contracts on that basis. The other thing I think as councillors you need to think about are the things that is what I would call democratic accountability. There are some services where you feel that democratic accountability if it's badly delivered. I had some of our colleagues over from our Norwegian sister union the other day, who were talking, they're very smaller councils in Norway, and they talked about I was asking them about, accreditation systems, scrutiny, etc. And they said, well, actually, Dave, it really doesn't matter in Norway, because if the old people's home is not being run very well, the officer in charge gets nobbled in the street because our council is so small that they will know people in that home. There's a level of accountability that we couldn't even dream about. So I would focus as a councillor on those things that you particularly feel that you're rightly going to come under democratic scrutiny for. Those are the things you want the control and the flexibility to be able to manage directly. There may be some other things that, whether it's a line pad or a straight pad, that frankly no one's got about too much, and so I'd agree with you on that.
Councillor Crothers.
Thanks, Chairman. 3 points. The first point, maybe in stats, if you've got them. You mentioned £10 billion was the Scottish Government spend in Scotland. I want to do know what their whole budget is, annual budget, and what the GDP of Scotland. You should put that into context. The outsourcing, you said it expected 25%. When outsourcing from local authorities or even government, you expect a 25% saving. In real terms, between 60 and 18% in your papers, I think. But when you were talking about potential 60% loss up to 8% gain, just could you put that into monetary, please, so I can get a better understanding of that? And when you talk about the corporation tax avoidance, what can a local authority like the Dumfries and Galloway Council do about that?
Thank you. As a broad rule of thumb, we're talking about a third of spending on that basis is going outside in terms of the Scottish Government, and that's in cash and percentage terms. In terms of the savings, I can't put that in a cash sum because it was a study done by the UK Government over a wide range of contracts. So it's not just government contracts, it was local authority ones. So they worked it out as a percentage of the savings that were offered and the savings that went delivered, essentially. So there's not a cash. There are numbers in the report. I'll happily send you the link to it. It was a study done by the UK Government comparing the claims made under the competitive tendering regime to what was actually delivered X number of years down the road. The important point very often with contracts is that it's not the price that appears when you're awarding the contract that often matters. What you need to do is look 5 and 10 years later and look at what you actually paid. Some years ago under competitive tendering, we employed, in fact, essentially a whistleblower or a poacher turned gamekeeper, a contractor in the cleaning and catering sector, who taught us, essentially, I learned all I know about how cleaning and catering contractors played the system from the managing director of a cleaning and catering company, who taught me all I need to know about how they won contracts and how they priced them. And essentially their strategy was to price at an almost no profit basis, but that made their money on cutting corners and contract variations. And it goes back to my point about flexibility. Is that it's very difficult to think now all the things you like to want in X number of years' time. Not unreasonably, you as councillors change your mind. You want there's a new challenge. You come and you say to the officers, we must do this. So therefore the contract changes. If I'm the contractor, I'm going to say, of course I'll do that for you. But that's a contract variation and you're going to have to pay for that. So the key thing when you're evaluating these matters is not the price at the time of the contract award, but it's later. So that's where those percentages come from, and it depends on the size of the contract, and it will vary on that basis. Your third point was about how you do the procurement, wasn't it? And
was it with corporation tax?
Corporation tax, sorry. Yeah,
what can Dumfries or a local authority in general do about that?
Sure, yeah. What you'll be able to do about it in the new Procurement Scotland bill, again, has this on the face of the bill, and there will be further guidance to show you how to do that. What public authorities right across Europe are doing is they're using it as part of their pre-qualification. This is not like the living wage where it's contract performance. They are asking companies what their arrangements are. So that, essentially they're saying, what are your arrangements for tax avoidance? Put it that way. The phrase is in the slide in terms of the arrangements, the tax arrangements that the company's doing, and therefore you're entitled to make a judgment about that. The key point for you, I would argue, as a council is if, for example, a local company in Dumfries is bidding for a contract, and they're a Dumfries company, they don't work anywhere else, they don't have multinational, they can't hide their money in Liechtenstein or the Cayman Isles, they pay corporation tax or they pay their taxes essentially because there's no way of them using these fancy mechanisms to do it. If you compare that with a multinational company that is, in Starbucks' case, what they do is they charge the Swiss part of the company a large sum of money for the logo on their mugs. That's one of the ways that they shift profits from there. Amazon, as you probably know, well documented, send the money via Luxembourg on that basis, and therefore they pay either very little or no taxes in this country. Is that fair and right on your local companies to be essentially lose out on contracts because these companies are using aggressive tax avoidance? This is not illegal, I should emphasise. So tax evasion, you can rule out companies now. That's already in the regulations. It's unlawful. Any tax evading company, you're entitled to exclude them straight away unless they have taken action to put right their illegal activity. Same with blacklisting and other arrangements, a similar process. But in terms of aggressive tax avoidance, there are judgments to be made, and you are entitled to make those judgments as long as you make them on the clear criteria, and hopefully the new guidance that will come out as a result of the procurement bill will help your procurement staff to take you through that and say, these are the options for us as a council, how far we are going to go down that area. But, you know, if you're interested in supporting local businesses, I think tax avoidance is one of those areas that you want to spend some time looking at.
Councillor Maitland.
Sort of semi-serious question. You're urging us to take courage and be more willing to take risk. Can Unison imagine itself writing a line to assist councils in the risk? Would you help us do that? To underwrite any risk?
Well, you mean offer a bond or something?
Well, you've in essence told us, never mind, it won't happen. So I'm challenging you to say, well, would you underwrite that risk?
Well, clearly we're not in a position to underwrite anything. What we can do is provide you with that sort of advice, which other councils are doing. All we're saying is that you as a council have a statutory obligation when you do this sort of thing to have a risk register, and you take risks and you lay down those risks. You have to make those judgments on that basis. I'm not making those judgments for you, and that's right. You know, that's what you're elected to do. Yeah, those are your judgments. I'm not standing for election in Dumfries. If I was, then that would be my responsibility. It's at the end of the day your responsibility. All I'm seeking to do is to show you ways that you can do that. I'm suggesting things that you might want to take into account. Whether you do so is entirely your decision in terms of doing that. It's advice and guidance. It's showing good practice. It's what other authorities are doing in trying to make progress in these areas.
I think the answer is no.
Right. If there's no further questions... No? Well, David?
Thanks, Chair. Could I perhaps make a comment? I'm not sure if we've touched on this aspect of it yet. We're doing all the procurement, and that's great. We've procured something, but the contractual arrangements that are put in place thereafter, like Dave says, regarding variations, regarding the quality of work that's done, perhaps even the work not been done particularly well at all, in fact, been done really badly in some cases, is a really, really important aspect of the procurement process. And I think that's an area where perhaps councils haven't been particularly good in the past at pinning down exactly what happens if they don't get a good service delivery out of the people that they've procured things from. You know, to give you an example, I've seen the same pothole being filled 3 and 4 times, and why would that happen, and why would you pay for it 3 and 4 times? Another element I'd like to touch on, though, is the employment practices of the people that you contract with at the moment. They aren't particularly good in a number of areas. As a council, we're an exceptionally good employer, probably one of the best employers, along with the NHS in the area. And what happens when people move away from the council because you're subcontracting things out, like home care delivery that's happened quite some time ago, is that the employers that take over these services aren't as good an employer as certainly we would like them to be. And if there could be something put into the procurement process to try and give certainly the people who currently work for you some feeling of security if they are going to move elsewhere, then that would be very beneficial.
Councillor Dyke.
Thank you, David. I think you actually touched on 2 very valid points. First point, I think, being contract management. And I think there are very few, if any, councils in Scotland actually employ anybody in their workforce as a contract manager. I don't, Dumfries and Galloway certainly don't, and I understand there are very few in the whole of Scotland, if any, who actually have people who are specifically employed as contract managers, and I think that is a very valid point. There's a lot to be learnt, because you're quite right, once the contract's in place, if nobody's actually doing the management of that contract, that is when there are huge issues. And your second point, which was about staff and possibly maybe even 2P transfers, etc. And I think that there is a learning curve there that maybe as a council we could learn from what's happening elsewhere in Scotland as well on that point. And it's maybe something that the committee could maybe look at in the future. So thank you for that.
with that, if we're, I don't know if you're in a rush to get away. Thank you for being here. We're going to recommendations. You can wait to see where we're going there, or if you're needing to leave, you go just now. Thank you very much. If we turn to the recommendations, we've received the presentation, and I think we've asked some good questions there in considering the information and evidence that we've received. Is there any points you thought would, through the presentation, that we should be taking forward, Lorna?
I think it would be appropriate just to recommend to members to consider the evidence you've received today, and also in terms of the slides that were distributed, and at the back of those slides the priorities that have been presented. I think for each of them, in terms of providing you with the evidence matrix and considering any recommendations you want to make, those individual items to be included, and the responses today for your consideration and any recommendations.
Councillor Dykes.
Sorry. Can we also maybe add into that the 2 points that David brought up, in particular the contract management, which obviously we have discussed as a committee before when we've been taking evidence regarding procurement. I think it's important that we actually look at that as a council, and the values of that and the terms and conditions, as well as possibly the terms and conditions of any 2P transfers, and whether or not this council could learn from others regarding David's 2 points.
Councillor Brodie.
Yeah, I think also there's a good point made about the long-term contracts which we enter into as a council, and I think that there's some very good points made there. It probably applies to the waste management contract and the arrangements for delivery of schools. Okay.
Well, if we're happy to include those as the evidence that we consider in future for the review, are members happy with that to be included?
Yes, there are other long-term contracts that we could look at as well, but yes.
Yeah, I think those were examples rather than the generality. Yep. Right, with that we'll move now on to Item 4, Scrutiny Review, Procurement and Commissioning, Evidence Sessions with Dumfries and Galloway Council. This report presents the record of the 3 evidence sessions that have taken place to look at the procurement arrangements and outcomes of 6 capital projects. We have Liz Manson here to answer any questions from members. Is there any questions on the evidence that we've received? Councillor Brodie.
More a point to be made on the future, what we do in the future. I think one of the recommendations is to involve DG first in a session. If you look at the first 2 studies there, the Hardthorne Road and the Brown Hall School, it mentions on page 10 the role of the planning and pre and post project approval is crucial, and new arrangements appear to be working more effectively. And the next one, it's in the key issues, planning regulation requirements more onerous for approval than had been suggested in informal dialogue. Would it be appropriate to maybe invite the planning to that session as well with DG first? So that we can...
That was something I sort of mentioned this morning, that how we actually work between the 2 services to make sure that we get the process right. It might be worthwhile just bringing them along, because these were things that came, is it stage left, I think they call it, at the last sort of moment, and I think it was 100,000 it cost us in one of them. So, yeah, I think it might be worthwhile. Councillor Gilroy.
Yeah, I mean, what came out really from quite a lot of the evidence that we had was that, when there was a change to the project, there was no, it just happened. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't come back to anybody. It just was, it just add on all the time. And, I'm looking particularly at Brown Hall School, which was, as Councillor Brodie said, that was partly due to planning, partly they came in with a different spec. And the cost of that was was fairly considerable to the overall project. And I just, you've got there of an action, review the arrangements, guidance of tendering for variations to original tenders. Where does that, we need to know where that goes. When you tender for a project and then it changes, who then deals with it? And it's not, we're not being made, that's not clear. And I think we go back to the fact of, a sort of not having a procurement tendering team that deals with these issues. And so therefore it gets muddled within the committees, the departments, whatever it is. And I just think that came up with that one. It came up with the Hardthorne Road one that changed, and that was because there was a change of personnel at the main contractor, which happened to be DG First in this case, and that caused a delay, and it never went anywhere. It just all happened, and I think we have sort of lost control a little bit somehow with the tendering, and I don't know how you bring that back, Liz, with another report, but I think we need to do something about that, because other departments are stepping in and changing the tender, and we are not being made aware of it, and it's always costing us money.
Yep. Certainly, I think one of the themes that came through the 6 projects that you looked at was about how the reports come to members, and the use of SharePoint, when are members notified about something and when are members asked to approve something. And even in the latter case, is it part of a composite report, which then makes it perhaps difficult to pick out the changes that are being made. And so that's certainly one of the recommendations for you to look at. And it may be that when you're producing recommendations from this review, that you might suggest there are some changes to the way that we currently do that. It was also an area where we thought it would be useful to talk to other councils about and see how they organise that information as well.
Councillor Wiper.
Thank you, Chair. The 2 events or discussions that I managed to attend were Brownhall School, which went from 412 to 865,000 in my recollection, without ever coming back to a committee for any agreement on that. I feel that projects like that, any project in fact, when the initial scope of the project is agreed, then that should be stuck to a very small percentage. And other than that, it should have to come back for approval, certainly to the tune of almost £500,000 without ever coming to a committee. It was nothing short of disgraceful, in my opinion. The other point that came out, and a very obliged to Jockey Kerr for his honesty, was the amount of pressure put on departments to spend money at the end of certain periods. And the project in particular was Crother's House, where there was slippage in other projects. There was money available to be then spent on this project, and there were items being done that weren't necessarily urgent just to get rid of this money, where there are other projects in this council, and I think in particular one, Cretan School, which is crying out for money being spent in it, where other monies is being spent just to get rid of it when the work's not really urgent. So that is something that really needs to be addressed. I mean, there are parts of this region where some public buildings are in really poor state and money is being spent elsewhere on things that aren't really needing it spent on, just to get rid of it at the end of a budget period. These 2 points I really feel it should be taken forward.
I think especially with that one, the ability to move budgets between services rather than just projects as well, because it seems to be if you get put into corporate services, you have to spend it in corporate services, although it might be better spent in education. So that's one that we need to take forward. Councillor Maitland, then Councillor Crothers.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't in with the bricks, so to speak, when this was first put together. So I wonder I could do with some help from the officers as to where we are in all of this process. The information, I thought the sessions were incredibly useful. Like Councillor Wiper, I thought the candour of the officers was very helpful. I think we got to the bottom of a couple of issues, but I want to know that we're not going to lose it, because this is all very high, high level, and I want to be sure that we get the information and it's then used and applied properly. So how are we going to do that?
In each of the appendices, you'll see the last section gives the feedback to this committee and then certain actions that we agreed, that issues that we want to take forward. So just to use Councillor Wiper's example there on page 20 about the Carruthers House project, one of the issues you did identify was this, is there a pressure to spend the money at the end of the financial year? So we've identified in the action that one of the things you want to do arising from that is to look at what are our arrangements for that. So you'll get the information about that, and then again it might be as you're developing recommendations from this review, you might want to recommend to full council that there are changes made to how we currently deal with that. So that at the stage at the moment you've taken the evidence, as we've identified in the covering report in 3.5, there will actually be a briefing note giving the exact figures when reports were given to committees and when indeed information was posted in SharePoint, so you've got the factual information for each of the projects as your evidence. And we've identified some areas that you want to take forward, and so we'll bring these back to you. And then at the end, when you're analysing all the evidence you've got, then you decide what areas you think we need to change.
Councillor Carruthers.
It was very similar just in regards to a preparatory meeting. Before we actually have this meeting in public, I think there's a lot of stuff needs to be asked, a lot of questions, and probably information asked for in regards to how the whole procurement process and bidding process works with DG First because of the information that came out at the last meeting.
Councillor Gilroy.
Yes, Liz has mentioned twice, I think, SharePoint, Liz. I think we discussed this and discovered that actually it wasn't very accessible. And I think if you're relying on that as a way for members to monitor how a project is going, I think we have to look at how easy or accessible it actually is, because I think we all discovered that, frankly, we didn't find it very easy. So I think that's just...
Yes, without preempting your recommendations, I think given the discussions that took place in these 6 projects, it would be likely that one of your recommendations is that we do have a different way of reporting to members on proposed or changes to projects that are being made.
Right, if there's no further questions, we've considered the evidence and information presented during the evidence sessions by Property and Agricultural Services as detailed in the appendices, and agree to an evidence session with DG First to discuss the selection and arrangements for in-house capital projects and discussions with other councils about the procurement arrangements. There was a previous mention that we would have planning possibly in to have a discussion, and I know Councillor Gilroy, I'll let you in.
It doesn't matter, I'm sure you're going to, because we talked about it earlier, but I wondered, we've got this written down here as we'd have a DG First in and then we'd go, it looks like then we'd go to other councils. I actually think it'd be more interesting to go to other councils, and then when we have DG First in and perhaps planning in, we are better prepared to ask a more varied amount of wider questions, because we are looking at it purely at the moment from our own points of view, and I think we need to go out to see what our own lot are doing, and I just wonder if that would be a better way to do it. And it's not that you have put it that way, but it's just the way it reads in the recommendation.
I think that we'll certainly be identifying a number of dates, but I think we can try and make it that way.
Are members happy with that proposal? Councillor Carruthers?
Happy enough with that proposal, but if we could have built in, even if we were going to visit another council, whether it's members or officers, whoever it is, happy for either or both, that we could build into that same day, possibly a preparatory meeting in regards, so we just maximise the use of that time, because I do think we need time to talk and discuss how we're going to move forward for that, again, to best effect the use of our time when DG first comes forward.
I think that'd be worthwhile because of the fact that it's been quite a wide-ranging review so far, and to bring everything together and into where we want to go in the future, it could take us maybe 1 or 2 additional meetings just to make sure we've got everything that we want in place. Right. Move on to item 5 now. Scrutiny review, procurement and commissioning, actions and next steps, report by Assistant Chief Executive. This report provides a summary of the activity undertaken in relation to the procurement and commissioning review and proposes a 2-stage approach to its completion. I think the 2 stages are A, to try and wind up the procurement part and then look at the commissioning as a second phase to wind that one up. Liz is here to answer any questions again. Do members have any questions on the way forward? Councillor Brodie.
Okay, we're talking about winding up the procurement part of it. Were there any issues raised today which sort of continues that agenda? So
obviously the decisions that you've made today about, for example, an evidence session with planning, visits to other councils and DG First, we'll add these into the future work programme.
Councillor Gilroy.
Yeah, it's to take up something that Councillor Dykes mentioned, and she felt quite strongly that there should be a procurement department, if you like. And we heard today from Dave that you know, what we need in the council is procurement professional, legal advice, but a procurement policy specialist. And we don't have, do we have any of that is properly trained, properly up to speed, and that can help the council with procurement? Because if we're going to do a recommendation to the full council, perhaps we need to say that we haven't got that, or we have, or we need to improve it.
We do have a specialist team, but it's a very small team. So Rona Lewis, well, interestingly, being a lawyer, but also a procurement specialist as well, and has done a lot of work in that area and a lot of qualifications aside of her legal status, her legal qualifications. And she's got a very small team there. I think in terms of making recommendations to full council, it would be helpful for members to look at how other councils are organised around procurement by way of comparison, and for you to consider whether that provides you with anything that you would wish to recommend. So I think maybe even in visiting some councils, but also to bring you some analysis of that comparison to your workshop for you to look at would be probably helpful.
There's no other questions on this one. No. Note the progress and actions taken for the procurement commissioning and scrutiny review. Agree that the procurement aspects of the review be concluded and reported to the council in September 2014, with the commissioning aspects dealt with as a second phase. Members happy with that?
I'm just wondering, you know, we've got to do quite a lot before September then, and I wonder if we will have the necessary yes, to put forward a realistic and good recommendation to the. I'd rather when we took it to full council, we had it absolutely bang on spot what we needed, and not saying, well, we're waiting to visit other councils or we're waiting to do this. We think we might have to do that. It would be far better if we could put a positive, definite way forward to the full council and see what happened. And I wonder if September is a realistic time. That's all.
Certainly we are anticipating the visits and the other evidence sessions to be able to take place, and you have a committee at the beginning of September when you would be looking at the report that we'll bring to you, a report that we would plan to take to full council, and you know, if you feel that there's further work needed before you're submitting your report to full council, then you could make that decision at the September committee.
And 2.3, review and agree the next steps for the scrutiny review as set out in appendix. I'm quite happy with those, with the additional comments.
We have a folder for you to take away today with all the evidence to date, just so that it's all in one place for you. And we'll add to that as the remaining visits and evidence sessions take place, but it captures all the information you've got to date.
Right, with that, we'll move on to item 6, Scrutiny Performance Committee Future Work Programme. This report allows members to develop the proposals for our future scrutiny review topics, as well as receiving reports from national bodies about our region's performance and other relevant issues. Liz is here to answer any questions on the report. Members have any questions? Councillor Crothers.
It's not so much a question of the report, it's just when we're looking at our future work programme, we've got a clear guiding here what we should be looking about. Something that's certainly come to my attention, and I think this is the appropriate place to bring it up, and I'd like to just run it past members. It's when a member of the council wants to make a complaint. There's no process whatsoever in place for a member of the council to make a complaint, and I think we should be looking at that. We can inquire, we've got the elected member inquiry services, we can put forward an issue or an inquiry. If we actually want to make a complaint, we have no process or way in which to do that. So I think we should be including that here. I think scrutiny performance, the only other option I've got, or any member's got, to make a complaint is to put a motion to full council, really, or speak to the director or the chair and vice chairman of a service committee or corporate committee, which I think is very unfair when it comes to being able to represent your actual constituents. I think we should have a complaints process in place for elected members, which at this time we haven't got. So I would like to add that to the list as well, please, Chairman.
Councillor Prentice.
Yeah, I think this very subject was brought up last week at the audit and risk. Don't know if Ian was there or not, but Mr. Haswell certainly said there was something in place, a proper procedure, and we're going to be looking into the procedures and that again. And I don't for the life of remember what was actually said about where it would go to. Maybe Lorna can keep us right.
Ian?
I was there, I was in the audience, I was listening, and Mr. Haswell referred to the elected members inquiry service. I clarified it with the chief executive a week past Monday, 2 weeks past Monday, and there is no process in place for a councillor to make a complaint. I made one on the 29th of November for absolute clarity, and I can pass that information on to whoever's got a lead in it, and there's no process for it to go forward, other than putting a motion to full council, or, like I say, speaking to the director or the chair and vice chair of a particular committee and try to take it forward in that direction.
Councillor Brodie.
I think it might be, are you on the ad hoc subcommittee? It's next week. Maybe that's the forum for that.
But I did speak to the chief executive at that time, and he said scrutiny performance would be the place to bring it up. And that's why I am bringing it up here.
I think in terms of procedures and standing orders for members, then the ad hoc subcommittee is the place to go with that. I appreciate you've had discussions with committee, with other officers, but I think that committee has looked at schemes of delegation, it's looking at standing orders and reform of these and improvement. And I think if it's a procedural matter for members, the council is the members to complain. You know, there is some sort of technicalities around that legal and process, and I think that would be a matter for you to take up in that committee and take advice from the officers there and the discussion with the members involved in that committee.
Councillor Prentice.
Yeah, just to sort of confirm what Ian's saying, I seem to remember that one of the issues was actually what happens with EMES. You know, after what happens is you get this word that says, you know, after 5 days, then after 15 days. I think the problem arose, what is the procedure after the 15 days are up? You know, what happens after that? And nobody seemed to have a particular answer to what happens. You get this email to say, this could take a while longer to actually investigate. You know, the 15 days are up. 15 days are up. But the procedure here now is that what you're requiring answers for will take a good bit of investigation, but there's nothing to say how long that investigation will take. It could take weeks, months, or whatever. I think that's basically what was being said last week, Chair.
I would think if it was specific to the EMES issue just now, that should be something that CCS should take forward and scrutinise. And if it's wider than that, I think it's maybe something that either policy and resources as the parent committee should actually address it. We should have a policy for complaints if councillors want to raise complaints. If they're not going to do it, then yes, I think it's something that we should, but I think they should be given their place to actually address the situation, and then if it's not being addressed, or if the performance in that isn't happening, then it should be coming to us as scrutiny performance.
Yeah, I think specifically it seemed to be this, this what happens after the 15-day period is up. There's no time limit after the 15 days, apparently.
Councillor Gilroy.
Yeah, I think I was at that committee as well, but I think I've just looked at the forward agenda for the next CCS meeting, and I'm sure I saw a report on EMES coming to that committee. So I would assume that's where members will pick it up and will proceed from there should there be anything more for scrutiny. But it will be, I think it's their next meeting for that committee.
Can we have it recorded that this has been asked for? However, I think possibly if it's general, it might be something that we could pick up in delegations to, or standing orders ad hoc sub. If not, possibly policy and resources need to have a look at issues with it, or CCS if it's specific to the EMES scheme, which I think they're administering. And if the performance doesn't improve, it's maybe something that needs to come back here to make sure that we can look at it and see where we can actually improve it.
I think obviously the clerk will take a note of that in a minute. I think the issue about whether it's the performance of EMES subject to CCS scrutiny is valid for this committee to look at that, subject to CCS's deliberations. But if it's about a new procedure or a gap in policy in terms of standing orders and delegation, that would be a matter for policy and resources or the ad hoc subcommittee. So there are two other committees that need to consider particular issues, and I've heard the word complaint and member inquiry, so it needs to sort of be considered in both of those places first, but it might be something members wish to take up subject to those deliberations and the performance information that's been scrutinised.
Councillor Crothers.
Chairman, I think you captured it very well yourself, and Lorna just explained it really well as well. But there's two aspects here. One is elected member inquiry service, and George is right, it's 3 days, 15 days, working days, that is, and it just disappears into ether. They don't have any KPI to actually capture that. But it is actual complaints I'm talking about, and the two are getting mixed up. And I think it's really, what's being proposed is the right way to go. Councillor Maitland as well as myself, I know are both on the Scheme of Delegations Committee next week. We can certainly raise it there. And if Community and Customer Services, they are already picking up on it, that was being referred for it from Audit and Risk. But I think if the actual complaint in councillors isn't captured anywhere else, if it's okay and we can bring it back to here, absolutely think that's the correct way to go forward.
With that, are we happy to take forward the 3 scrutiny reviews around means of access to council services, small town and village facelift schemes, and approaches to tackling poverty and deprivation?
In the previous item, there were 2 areas that David had raised, one on contract management, and I think the other was on GP transfer, yeah, get it right. Particularly on the contract management, do members want us to develop a scope around that as a distinct piece of work, aside from the procurement work, or do you want to take more time to consider that?
Councillor Crothers.
Thanks, Chairman. Would that take an ALUs? Because I think something we could potentially be looking at, whether it comes off or not, but that would that cover the ALU aspect of that as well?
Certainly, we could certainly have a discussion at the next preparatory workshop about what you would like to consider. Considering these ones were just suggested this morning, we could look at, and indeed if you want to include ALUs.
So we'll include those 2 points as future work. Agree to develop scope, specific objectives, timescales and evidence required for the reviews through further briefing sessions. I think we're happy with that. And note the topics for other reports to the committee as outlined in paragraph 3.12. I'm happy to agree that. Brings me to item 7. Any other business? I have no other business in front of me. Can I thank you all for your